All right, the recording is going. So as all the students are filing in, I wanted to remind everybody, I mentioned last time that there was the extra credit question paper available. I'll jump to the syllabus. So here on the same day that the final question paper is due, which is a second, I had an email about this. The final question paper is not a revised draft of your first one. The second question paper is an entirely new question paper, a new question, new resources. It could be connected, like similar topic as your first one, but it should be a completely new paper with new research, so new peer-reviewed research, new web sources, things like that. So brand new question paper for this final question paper here. The extra credit question paper is an additional question paper. So it would be a third question paper on a new question, new peer-reviewed references, those kinds of things. So it is worth a lot of points. It is worth 50 points, which is quite a big chunk. If, for example, you missed one of the question papers, like the first question paper, this would make up for that. With this, you will need to have a high quality paper to earn all 50 of those points. So I will definitely be looking at them and grading them. You won't get, you probably just based on time and grading and getting things in and grades in, I probably won't give you feedback on your extra credit one. I will give you feedback on your final question paper. But if you do an extra credit paper, just email that straight to me with a subject saying extra credit question paper or something like that. And then I can grade that, and I will just put that grade in the grade book, and you'll see that appear there, but you won't see any like written comments on it. So any questions about that or question papers in general? Hopefully you have some ideas and have even started or even finished working on your final question paper. All right, well, happy Earth Day as well. Hopefully you have a great Earth Day. Let's get started with our lecture. We'll kind of review a little bit of what we talked about last time at the very end, just to kind of lead us into our group activity. But we definitely have enough people to split up into groups. So let's get started with these things. So Erikson's theories, just brief review. Erikson did have a bunch of stages across the lifespan and challenges that, or crises that people had to get through to get to the next stage. So if you remember, infancy, trust versus mistrust, and what that is related to. So a sense of trust with the caregiver or not trusting a caregiver. This is kind of similar to what later developed into things like attachment research, and looking at secure attachments, insecure attachments, autonomy versus shame and doubt, starting to gain some independence, doing things on your own, preschool initiative versus guilt. Are you a good or a bad person? You're learning rules. We started talking about Kohlberg's theory of moral development and where children were at that point. So Erikson's theories, Kohlberg's theories, Piaget's theories, a lot of them can overlap. So these are some of the stage-like theories of development that we've talked about. As we talked about in one of our first classes, a lot of lifespan development is not quite stage-like, like you develop this thing and then you develop this thing. It's pretty continuous on most things. There are some things that are discontinuous. So developing abstract thought really only happens once certain aspects of your neurology wire up, and then now you can think abstractly, and it might look to an outside observer that that happens day to day, that one day you couldn't and then the next day you can as a child. So there are some things that are discontinuous like that, growth spurts in early childhood as well. So hopefully you remember some of these aspects. Identity versus role confusion, we talked about that one a lot. Intimacy versus isolation, we talked about that. We were just talking about generativity versus stagnation and ego identity versus despair, which is also really similar to identity development in adolescence. So this is one theory of lifespan development. So Erikson's theory covered all the way from infancy all the way to late adulthood and death. So these were the main primary key crises that had to be resolved at these different times as a person developed. So this was essentially Erikson's theory of lifespan development. Others that we've talked about are just the periods of development, so put those up there. We've talked about Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model, so hopefully I've hammered that home enough for you that you kind of have a general understanding of this. This is one thing I felt like in my undergrad I didn't get a good sense of, didn't have a good understanding of. We kind of touched on it on maybe a chapter or two in maybe 2 different classes that I had. And then when I went into a fully developmental program, I didn't realize that this was the primary theory of human development that was used at the time. I thought it was just one and that people kind of picked and chose. Probably just either me not understanding things in undergrad or maybe it wasn't emphasized as well as it should have been. So with that, this is one of the primary developmental theories that other theories are based off of, is this general idea that there are contexts like culture, society, and community. We can see that here in the macro system, norms and values of the culture. So Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model and Lerner's developmental systems theory are under a umbrella of systems theories. So that's where we are now in lifespan development. We have systems theories looking at all the systems and how they impact an individual developing through time. So this is 2 different ways to look at it and some different emphases in each of these. So some researchers might favor more Bronfenbrenner's model. Some people might favor Lerner's model. I favor Lerner's model a little more. But both of these have a lot of the same assumptions under the theory. When you're working with one, you're not competing with the other. So hopefully I've given you a pretty good sense of that, of what developmental psychology is doing today, especially since we've looked through the lifespan at a lot of these different aspects impacting different points in a person's lifespan. So we've also talked about the developmental cascades model, which is another model of lifespan development that you can have risk factors, protective factors, different things happen to you, lead you to more maybe negative outcomes on this side or positive outcomes on this side. So we want people to be towards thriving. You can look at this in an applied way of trying to give people more protective factors and support them so that they end up thriving in their life somewhere around here. Even if there are certain challenges, and that at any time there's enough plasticity to make changes. So we also talked about Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. We talked about the overall sociocultural theory briefly. Mostly we focus on the zone of proximal development and scaffolding. So we talked about that many, many times. We brought that up even last class period. So with this, the broader sociocultural theory is that a culture in general is going to give a person tools to live and work and thrive within that culture, and that we learn that from social interactions, peers, parents, teachers, mentors, things like that. So zone of proximal development is specifically about training and learning new skills. So what you can do with help, that is the zone of proximal development, and then what you can't do. So hopefully a lot of this is review, and maybe it's stated again in a different way altogether at the end of class now that it kind of makes it click better or differently, or it might just be completely review and you already understand these things and you're ready to take it off into the world. That would be great as well. So Piaget's stages, we've talked about them briefly. Your book emphasized them more than we did in class. So sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. These are all around cognitive faculties that humans have. So we looked at some examples of these, and essentially from formal operational beyond, that's when Piaget thought the end was. There's also post-formal, so later researchers after Piaget added another stage of post-formal operational thinking. So this is based on Piaget's work. So that's another theory of cognitive development throughout the lifespan. So, and very stage-like, again, similar to Erikson's. So our activity, what we're going to be doing is, rather than writing our names on a paper, we're going to get into our little groups. So as a reminder of where to go for those, I will pull this over here. So as a reminder of where to go, if you click on Teams, you should be able to see should see something different than that. Why is it doing that? Did the groups disappear? Where are the groups? Also, can you even see me still? That is strange. Right before class, my teams died.
Yeah, I can see you, but I cannot see the groups either.
Okay. On your own apps, can anybody see the groups? So if you go to your own teams and try to click through, can you see your own groups? Okay, some of you can. All right, this probably is just a problem with mine. I may have to just close and reboot Teams to be able to see the groups. If you cannot see your groups, again, they should be. I think it's because mine crashed and did something weird right before class. They should be right here. When you click on Teams, you should be able to click on our class and see multiple groups. So pick which one corresponds with your last name, click into there, join the group, and this is what you'll be doing. You will be doing thinking up your own theory together as a group. Think up your own theory of lifespan development. So are you going to focus on biology and neurology? Are you going to focus your theory around cognition? Or is the self and identity development most important? Or are relationships most important? Or are a couple of those aspects most important? What are the main pieces you would like to include, or the time points you would like to emphasize, like key or critical points of change? So I know we talked about a couple different theories and we just reviewed a couple different ones. You can take pieces from those if you want, and you can modify them. You can decide as a group that, well, this one actually is the best because of X, Y, and Z. So essentially, figure out your own theory of lifespan development. If it does correspond a lot with one of these that we just talked about, that's fine. But if you think there should be some additional emphases that are not included there, so definitely do that. So any questions about what to do and what to discuss? Essentially, you're talking about what should be important, what should go into your own theory, making your own couple maybe bullet points of what the theory is about and what it covers. So questions about that before I leave Microsoft Teams and try to come back in and make things work? I don't see any hands or any comments. So hopefully you're understanding what is needed. So jump into those groups that are corresponding with your last name, and we should be there about 15 minutes, I would suspect. If it's going quicker than that, that would be fine. But expect to be back in this main general classroom at 9 o'clock. So go off in those groups and do those discussions. Oh, I was on mute. As everyone is slowly coming back into this room, we'll give people a little bit of a chance to get back here. But I heard some really good discussions in the different class or in the different small groups. Oh, I'm not sharing screen anymore. Let's do that. So, as people come in, think about some of the main things that you talked about in your groups, and hopefully some of you will be willing to share a few things. I heard some discussions over cultures and how to incorporate that more, or that might need a bigger focus, that maybe your lifespan development theory would include a lot of focus on cognition. Some people thought there should be a big focus or a larger focus on biology than some of the things that we've read. And then another one was on relationships. So those were some of the key points that in my jumping around sounded like were some of the most important points that people were making in the theories for their own theories. Does anyone want to describe their entire lifespan theory, what kinds of pieces they incorporated, what things they would change, what things they felt like should be focused on? Now, if we did research in lifespan, or we're looking at the lifespan in its entirety.
We talked about the relationship because we noticed that like a lot of things that happen in childhood will have a big um, impression later on. So it's almost like a cascade. Like if you have a good childhood, like you be better at your relationships, at school, work, you be happier. And if you don't have as good as childhood, then your life will be not as good if you don't change it. And we talked about like ways to change that. Like if that happened to you, like you can start like therapy. Like we talked about depression, ways to get help. And I think for us, like the best way to do that was a longitudinal study, um, and just focus like on relationship.
Yeah, I liked those discussions I was hearing from your group. So thank you for sharing the overall view, because I got pieces of that, but not the whole picture. So thank you. I also think it's interesting how many groups, when going from theory, they went immediately to also research methods, even though that wasn't actually explicitly part of the activity. So I found that interesting, made me a little proud as well, that you're thinking, well, how would we actually go and do that and actually test this theory, or look at that and have a bigger focus on this piece of what we feel is important. So that makes me happy. So really great job with doing that. Yeah, for relationships, that sounds very similar in some ways to sociocultural theory. So that the relationships with other people have a big impact on us throughout life. So it sounds like it's kind of combining some aspects of sociocultural theory, some aspects of developmental cascades, and that these things that happen to us can be changed and modified. So there's definitely plasticity involved in that theory that you're talking about. So even though you might not have put these words or terms into it in your discussion, hopefully this can help other people as they hear your description and thinking about these theories, make some additional connections. So really good. I think that is an important piece, that some of the aspects of research that we looked at in the chapters didn't necessarily focus on as much as maybe they could have, of how much relationships and our interactions with people can affect us. In some ways, I wish that we could have like a whole chapter on just social psychology in this, but that's kind of in the general class to get a good sense of that. That and the abnormal psych chapters. So we have a little bit of personality, but I mean, that's kind of beside the point. Sorry about that. Any other groups that want to share a little bit about their theory, what they thought is some of the most important components of lifespan and those kinds of things?
I guess I can share a little bit about our group. Our group kind of jumped around on lots of different things, so I hope I don't miss anything. But we were one of the groups that talked about how we would test our theory, and we thought that it'd be important to have a focus on biology, so that we'd have stuff to back us up. We thought that relationships were important because that kind of impact how different, like, we thought that your relationships with different people in your lifetime can make an effect on other things in your life. And then we also did talk about culture and how we would want to see how to look at more holistically how all humans develop across the lifespan rather than just having it be US centric.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I like the discussion of how you do need to look at it in a longitudinal way, how things happen earlier on, or even in adolescence or in midlife, and look at what happens after that. Longitudinal studies are really good for that because they help us to follow and see how things impact people over time, because you're following those individuals. They're not done as commonly just because they are more expensive, they're more intensive to do. And we researchers are poor creatures, so we don't have a lot of money to do a lot of longitudinal studies, which is kind of sad. But I also like your focus on culture. And that's one thing I wanted to bring up, because when we look at sociocultural theory, this is kind of embedded into this. When we look at learners' developmental systems, culture is this biggest bubble here. So there's an understanding that culture across the world influences everything. And here in Bronfenbrenner's, this is also in the macro system. So it's always impacting things. But I heard some comments from your group that a lot of the research that we look at didn't necessarily look at culture or was very US centric. So how then do you take that value or that thing that's important to your theory that, well, here we see with one of the biggest theories that's used in lifespan development, culture is that biggest bubble. It's impacting everything. But most of the research is looking at the microsystem. And so with that, you're doing lots of studies and trying to build them on top of each other to extend out and understand things like economic systems, mass media, testing these things across different cultures. But no one study can necessarily look at this entire model. And that's just something that's kind of taken for granted in the field, that's a limitation with the way we measure things or test things or can do research. But perhaps right now there's work being done. I won't go into a ton of detail, mostly because I don't understand all of it, about current research methods that are being tried to be longitudinal and look at things cross-culturally. One example of that is measurement invariance, trying to make measurement tools. So like the survey that you could have done for one of the extra credit things, the Claremont Purpose Scale. It's a scale that I created with a team, and we used people from all over the US, but still people from the US. So to test measurement invariance, one thing we're doing now is testing it in other cultures, see if other people are responding in the same way, see if they do think of purpose in the same way, or if it does correspond to aspects of their life. And that's hard because when we're trying to correlate measures with our measure, well, we have to have good measures in that culture already. So there's other ways to do it too, but measurement invariance is one to make sure it doesn't, measuring in different cultures doesn't change the way the measurement is used. Also, you have to do things like translating it and making sure the message is still the same in the questions across. So that's a big part of what honestly more researchers should be worrying about right now, because it's one of the biggest challenges is how do we measure all the different aspects of this? How do we put it all together? So I like that you picked up on that, and that culture is, even though we kind of give lip service to it in a lot of studies, we're not doing a great job at actually figuring out how culture does play into the development across the lifespan at large. This is also a problem with US-centric classes too. If you look up research that's coming out of, say, Germany or Australia, it does a better job being a little more cross-cultural, getting populations from other places and things like that. And a lot of that just comes down to networking, that researchers need to network with people in that location. So I don't know enough about Liberia, for example, but there was a team in Liberia who came to our lab and said, hey, we want you to check the essentially the well-being of a lot of orphans that are orphans because of war and famine and terrible pandemics there. Essentially, we want to see the well-being of these orphans and if these specific government programs we have in place and community programs are improving their well-being. And we're like, well, that's great. We want to do that. But at the same time, are our measures going to work there? Is it going to make sense? We're going to have to translate it to different languages. So what we needed was people on the ground and connecting to people who were doing the work there so that they could essentially educate us, or they could be the kind of masters of the research in that area. So that kind of networking is really important for doing this kind of cross-cultural work. It's not necessarily up to us to learn everything about everything, but we need to connect and be multidisciplinary and connect with people that have that expertise in that area. So we found people who are statisticians in that area, people who had degrees in development, people who were working with the young people there, and they're who we connected with. And so while we still are working with them, and so now they're kind of like part of our team. They're like in a different location and they understand that area and that culture, so they know better what to look at than we would, even if we came in and had things told to us in, say, a couple meetings. So that's a really important piece. And I kind of went on maybe a few more tangents than necessarily is relevant at this level of lifespan development class, but hopefully you have a better sense of what we're doing as scientists to get at that component better. But it is a challenge, and I think those of us in the US are doing a little worse job than some other countries are doing with it, with that networking. So jumping back to the main points, do we have another group that has some other pieces that we haven't talked about already, some other focuses that we maybe have not discussed? All right, well, this task of creating your own theory of lifespan development is kind of a big one. So hopefully it helped you think about, well, what's important? What do I think is most important across the lifespan? I don't expect you to go out of this class and start actually testing a brand new theory of lifespan development, different than what other people have done before. But hopefully, with this knowledge, with this activity, you kind of pinpointed some things that maybe you had forgotten even that are important across the lifespan. There was another group that talked about, it might have been one of the groups that discussed already actually, that talked about a bigger focus also on adulthood. And I think of the challenges and problems in the field that we've talked about, I think that's probably one of the ones that's being worked on better than some of the others, looking at people in middle and late adulthood. Still some of the same problems, though, like being US centric and whatnot. So really good ideas there. Hopefully we've got a better sense of what the field does in general, the kind of research and science that we do, how we work with people, and are multidisciplinary. So hopefully this brings back some of the discussions from chapter 1 or 2. I probably should actually review those couple slides on theory before doing this activity, I was realizing too. So sorry about that. I'll add that in for the next class who does this activity. All right. So with that, let's talk about socio-emotional development in late adulthood. So this again focuses on social relationships, emotions and emotional relationships as well. So Activity theory is the name of a theory that I've made reference to quite a few times now. Essentially, the idea that the more active older adults are, the more likely they're going to be satisfied with their lives. So with that, if they continue the roles that they had in middle adulthood, whether it's working or as a mentor or volunteering, whatever roles they had in late adulthood, if they're continuing those on, they will tend to be at a higher well-being, they'll be healthier longer, cognitive health will be up, those kinds of things. There might be things that they can't do anymore. So maybe after a hip injury, they can't do dancing like this couple here is doing. So then they need to substitute that activity. So maybe now they go and they set up dances for the community, or so they substitute roles or activities that they can't do anymore, and they continue being active in different ways. So a key component here is oftentimes these are thought of as leisure activities, but this activity doesn't have to be just leisure. It can be things like volunteering. So socio-emotional selectivity theory is a theory that tries to describe what happens with social networks for older adults. Oftentimes older adults we see, so one thing we see from the data is older adults' social networks start to shrink when they're in late adulthood. So socio-emotional selectivity theory says, well, maybe this is because they're spending more time with people who they have really good relationships with. So their network might have been, I don't know, let's just make a random number. They might have had 30 people in their network, but out of those 30 people, maybe only 15 really help them feel rewarded. They have a really great relationship with those 15 people. So rather than focusing their time and energy on all 30, they focus their time and energy on that 15. So that's the socio-emotional selectivity theory. So this says that, well, while their networks might be shrinking, this might not be because of loneliness or despair, and it might not be leading them to be lonely or feel despair. They might just be being more selective with their energy. So they know they only have so many hours that they can like go out and do something or call someone on the phone. They only have so much energy for that. So they select it for the most rewarding relationships that they have. So with that being said, this might be true for some people, but it doesn't appear like it's true for all older adults. So for some people, that is probably why their network shrinks. They're selecting their energy in specific places. But also, other people do different things. Instead, they focus on other meaningful goals, volunteering, you changing and working in the community. So the socio-emotional selectivity theory is not true for everyone, essentially. But it's one way to try to describe what we see, that shrinking of those networks. But as long as you're doing these things, focusing on meaningful goals, working with other people, whether it's just helping people or hanging out or playing games, it's going to be better for your well-being. So an interesting bit of knowledge is some of the priorities that people give different things at different times in their life. So here we've got work, friends, family, and independence in basically early adulthood, then middle adulthood, well, early middle adulthood, late middle adulthood, late adulthood, and then very late adulthood. I don't think we have really a good term for the very end of life. So just take a look at this really quick. So I find it interesting that family is a fairly lower priority for early adults, and then middle adults it jumps up and stays high until the very end of life, it seems. Family is not quite as important as focusing on health. Cognitive fitness, it's interesting to see that's not even on the board here of the priorities in early adulthood, but then it appears and gets more important around late adulthood. Here it's interesting that we see friends also drop off at this time, which is a little different than what we might have expected from the socio-emotional selectivity theory, unless they get more rewarding relationships from family, which might be the case.
Or maybe they're dying. You don't
Yep.
have any friends.
Yep, that could be true as well. So that part of their social network decreasing might be those people aren't around anymore. And so if they have 30 and 10 of those people die, now their social network is down to 20. Yeah, really good practical input there. All right, so selective optimization and compensation theory is essentially about what to do to select and focus on to optimize your well-being throughout adulthood. So selection is that you might have a reduced capacity in certain things. Maybe your lung capacity is reduced, maybe your ability to walk is reduced, whatever it is, you might have loss of function of certain things. So with that, you can optimize, so you can either maintain performance in those areas and decide, well, I'm going to focus on my walking ability, or you can focus on your cognitive ability and optimize that. So new technologies might help that. So a motorized wheelchair might still help you be mobile, so you can optimize that way. And essentially, the wheelchair example is a good example of compensation. So you need to compensate when life tasks require a higher level of capacity than you have. So whether it's using things like tools, like a motorized wheelchair. So this is something older adults should maybe be supported in doing, is figuring out and having time to really consider, like, well, what capacities am I losing? What do I want to maintain and work and spend energy to do? What aspects might I want to optimize? Cognitive faculties might be a really good one to optimize. And then how will I compensate for these things? Will I need, say, help of another person, say a live-in nurse or something like that? Do I need to be in assisted living? Do I need a motorized wheelchair? Things like that go into this conversation. All right, so we talked about personality, and the main theory of personality we talked about was the Big Five. Again, if you take a general psych class, you'll get a couple other personality theories, but this is the main one that is used most broadly. So hopefully you remember openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. As you look at this, and I say those things, is there anyone that doesn't remember one or more of them that we could go into really quickly? Because we're going to talk about some correlations with these in late adulthood.
I'm not really sure about the extroversion.
All right, does anyone want to explain extroversion really quickly? All right, I will do it. So extroversion is a personality trait essentially of where there's a couple different ways to say it. So one way to say it is extroversion is kind of where you like, how much activity with other people do you like to or feel good with engaging with. So do you want to be more in like bigger groups and doing things with other people and strangers that you might not know, or introversion is what you would prefer and where you feel most comfortable, where you get your energy from is more small groups of closer friends or just yourself. So it's kind of, it's definitely correlated with things like openness, but extroversion is, would you prefer to and feel better in like larger group settings, strangers, people that you don't know, versus introversion on the other end of the spectrum would be basically yourself. So, and there's that continuum where maybe you're comfortable with small groups of people, maybe a few strangers, but not a whole. Maybe you wouldn't want to, say, go to a TED conference because there'd be a lot of people there that you wouldn't know, and you'd feel a lot more overstressed rather than learning things because of that environment. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of extroversion versus introversion. So it's a personality trait that's predictive of certain things.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of these correlations in late adulthood. So conscientiousness, so this one, predicts lower mortality risk from childhood all the way throughout late adulthood. So at any point in the lifespan, people who score higher on conscientiousness are at lower mortality risk. So they're going to be more conscientious of things like their health behaviors, as just one example. That might lead to a causal relationship there. So high neuroticism, so this one, is linked to negative emotions. So it's positively correlated with negative emotions. So the higher you are on neuroticism, the more likely you are to also have a lot of negative emotions. And if you have those negative emotions and you have a lot more negative emotions in late adulthood, it's also likely that you're also more frail in late adulthood. So neuroticism, you could think of one end of the spectrum being very, very worried about a lot of different things. If someone had hypochondria, for example, felt that they had a lot of illnesses, they would probably score high on a measure of neuroticism. If someone was very often having mood swings, they would probably score high on a measure of neuroticism. So it's a pretty broad trait that kind of correlates with a couple other things. So hopefully that gives you a sense of maybe the lived experience of someone who's very high on the scale of neuroticism. So conscientiousness again. So higher conscientiousness, lower mortality risk, longer life, as well as reduce risk, reduce and risk put together, reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's. So perhaps that's because they're doing these health behaviors, they're paying attention to their cognitive faculties, maybe they're concerned about that, they're working on those already. So that's one possible reason. So these personality traits, we've talked about how they're pretty broad. I mean, essentially it's 10 because you've got openness, or on the other end of the spectrum, closed, neuroticism or no neuroticism, agreeableness or disagreeable, extroversion, introversion, conscientiousness or not conscientious. So essentially you've got just these 10 points and spectrums between them to predict these things. So while we could predict that someone higher on conscientiousness is likely to live longer and is less likely to develop Alzheimer's, it's hard to predict much more specifically than that when we've got really broad traits. So with that being said, higher levels of agreeableness, and so high agreeableness, low neuroticism, less likely to develop dementia. So if you don't have high neuroticism and you are highly agreeable, you might be interacting with people more. You might be involved in your community or with your friends more than someone who's opposite, high in neuroticism and low in agreeableness. So, and that might be some of the reasons why you're less likely to develop dementia. So higher levels of conscientiousness and openness to experience, so high on both of those, openness and conscientiousness, agreeableness and extroversion, all of those are linked to positive emotions. So things like happiness or joy, humor. Well, humor's a character's strength, not an emotion itself. Yeah. So we can look at these personality traits and kind of predict some things about people generally, but we wouldn't necessarily be able to pinpoint one individual and say, okay, you're 70 on openness, 70 on conscientiousness, 40 on extroversion, 30 on agreeableness, 30%, and then 50% on neuroticism. We predict that exactly these things will happen to you in your life. We still only have pretty general ideas of what could be predicted based on these personality traits. So they're not useless, obviously. So that kind of prediction is better than none and can kind of show us where we might aim if we were trying to help people have higher well-being. Well, if higher levels of conscientiousness, openness, agreeableness, and extroversion, if all of those lead to positive emotions or are correlated to, maybe there are some causal related variables. So maybe we could investigate that and help people have a more thriving and happy life with more positive emotions if we focus on those variables. All right, so we'll jump to stereotypes for older adults. So ageism, we've mentioned it last time as well. So this is prejudice against other people because of their age. Usually we refer to this as ageism for older adults, but I think I brought it up in adolescents because we often see it there as well, that adolescents are a lot more capable than people generally tend to think. That's ageism right there, not expecting that an adolescent can or should do something that they're capable of just because of their age. Same thing, and we see it a lot with older adults. So ageism often leads to attitudes and perceptions of older people that they're incapable of thinking clearly. And one thing we've seen from our cognitive research is they can think very clearly. Those cognitive faculties until very late adulthood stay really sharp. So even if they cannot hear as well, so they might have lost that physical capacity, does not mean that they cannot think as well. That's something that I often see just in day-to-day life around people, like in stores or whatnot, with people who are older. If they can't hear well, they might be assumed to not be able to think well, and that's not the case. So they, sorry, my brain just went on a tangent. I'm trying to keep myself from going on that tangent. So holding responsible jobs is another thing that a lot of people don't assume that older adults cannot do. Part of it comes down to this thinking. But as we looked at the research last time, for older adults in the workforce, they tend to have less accidents. They tend to be more happy. They tend to, sometimes in different spheres, be more productive than younger workers. So there's also a thought that, or a perception that older adults don't enjoy sex, or that they can't contribute to the community, both of which are very untrue. So we don't often talk about the sex lives of older adults. And we don't even really much in your textbook, but they do and can have active sex lives, and will focus a lot on contributing to the community. So with that, there's other perceptions of aging that are relevant to the economy in the U.S. So there's concern that the economy can't bear the burden of so many older people who are going to be consumers, who might not have as much of an income as well, getting them adequate medical care, things like that. So with that, older adults are some of the primary patients that require health care. So as the body is aging, you need to go to the doctor more, you need to get things like hearing aids or surgeries for cataracts. So with this, many older adults also suffer from chronic diseases, which requires consistent medical care. So there's a concern about that, about healthcare, as well as elder care. So it can be a challenge. I think we've heard from some of our students as well that it can be a challenge to care for people who are elderly. That it can, yeah. So with that, these are some issues in aging, and there could definitely be some good solutions to those. And that's one thing applied psychologists try to do as well, is especially those who are interested in evaluation and policy. Applied psychologists will look at things like healthcare or economic impacts of older adults and try to see what kinds of changes or manipulations essentially can be done to support older adults, help them thrive, how to advocate for good policy for older adults. So one interesting thing is that's found in evaluations is that policy change, while for a scientist, so for me, looking at studies that are really representative of a population, large sample sizes, not a lot of confounding variables, like really good research will be more convincing to me to change my mind on something. When you take that to, say, a policymaker, that doesn't tend to change their mind. And for a scientist, that's really frustrating. We see this with climate scientists as well, feeling frustrated that it's like, hey, we put out this whole International Panel on Climate Change book about all the information. But interestingly, and this is pretty true of people in general, not just policymakers. So I'm not just trying to throw them under the bus. I'm saying this is a thing humans do, is it tends not to be convincing to see stats and numbers and things like that. Anecdotes, Stories, something that you can make a personal connection to, tend to be more convincing. So one way that a lot of child advocacy groups that are connected to developmental policy and evaluation, as well as some elder care groups, have done is bring in to a policymaker's office or have them like come and visit a place where they can actually meet like 2 or 3 or a couple people who've been impacted by a specific type of policy, and so they can see directly and talk with that person about how it's changed their life. So essentially hearing that story, hearing that anecdote, having that specific example can make a bigger connection with a policymaker. And this tends to be when we're looking at how to change just human minds, this also tends to be one of the most effective ways to change any person's mind. So it's hard for me as a scientist to, when I see, say, a Facebook argument, to not put in stats or something like that, but to remember that doesn't tend to be convincing. So the same kind of things that help policymakers understand the impacts of certain policies are things like stories and anecdotes, even though we might kind of discount them as a piece of evidence. It can be a really convincing thing that humans do a good job at connecting and finding meaning in something like a story for someone. So sorry, a little bit of a tangent, definitely relevant to elder health care and getting them the care they need, changes in how hospitals do things as well. That can be one of the best ways to change people's minds, essentially, is direct connection with people involved in it. Not just like a video of it as well, the more direct connection that they have, and the bigger impact it's going to have. So, all right. With that, technology, pros and cons. Jumping back to the content. Older adults who have higher abilities in technology have a lower likelihood of depression. They also tend to connect with family, friends, and neighbors more often. So a good example of this is my family got a great-grandparent an iPad so they could make FaceTime calls at the beginning of the pandemic. So because they hadn't known how to do that. It still took them a while to figure out because it was hard to teach and show them how to use it when you were trying to be distanced from that person. But yeah, that's one thing that can really help. So technology has some pros in that ways, but also can have some cons. It can be a avenue where older adults might waste a lot of time. So rather than doing active leisure, they might be doing passive leisure with watching too much TV, for example. So older adults watch an average of 51 hours and 32 minutes of TV per week. And so that's quite a lot. And that contributes a lot to sedentary behavior. And so that's less social, less physically active. They're probably not watching that TV and, say, walking on a treadmill. So being more active in their leisure pursuits is better. So technology has those pros that we can connect people to each other, but it also has those cons, is that it allows us kinds of passive and sedentary behavior. So I don't know that we'll finish all of this in some of the aspects of relationships in older adulthood, but let's try to get through some of these. So in 2016, about 58% of US adults over 65 were married. Oh, not the right way. So marital satisfaction tends to be rated higher in older adults than it does in middle adulthood. So retirement oftentimes alters a couple's lifestyle pretty dramatically. So whether it's both of them retiring or one of the couple retiring, it changes a lot of aspects of their life. The time that they have to spend with each other, the kind of leisure activities they can now pursue, whether they're concerned or not concerned with money. So retirement can be a big change within the context of that group, of the couple. So older adults, married or partnered, are usually happier and tend to live longer than those who are single, as well as married LGBT individuals who are older than 50 years report better quality of life, more economic and more social resources than people. And I'm not sure from this stat if this is unmarried partnered counterparts that are also LGBT or if this is just in general. So sorry about that. I didn't have time to check that right before class because I forgot. Well, like I forgot and I was like, oh, I need to double check that, but I didn't have time to check it. So interesting though. So There are still some that are divorced or separated in late adulthood. When you're divorcing in late adulthood, it has the same kinds of social, financial, and physical consequences, but they have those additional challenges of someone being in late adulthood. So if there was a partner that you relied on to help remind you to take your pills, for example, that you need, or that could help you to do some physical activities that you weren't capable of, that can be an additional challenge that you might not have had in middle adulthood. If you're both retired and you had a shared income, now that now that's split in half, so the financial challenge I think is pretty understandable, but also social. So you have this narrowing social network. If maybe half of that is cut off, that's further narrowed. So that can be a challenge as well as ageism at this time. With that being said, remarriage is becoming more common in older adulthood. So there are people tend to be healthier longer. So even in late adulthood, many people are choosing to get married, which can have a lot of the benefits that we've talked about of married individuals, or correlated to those benefits. So there is also cohabitation among older adults. So approximately 3% of older adults in 2016 were cohabitating rather than being married. The stat here says, and the book tells you, that often this is more for companionship than for love. And I just wanted to ask a question really quickly. What do you have to say about that when you think about the triangle theory of love, or the triarchic theory of love? So the researchers concluded that these people cohabitating, they were doing it more for companionship than love. If you remember the triangle theory of love, what pushback might you give to them? Or maybe questions that you'd have for them? Maybe I'll pull it up again. I'll just pull up the triangle theory of love on screen. All right, well, this is a little smaller than I wanted to find, but it's the words are pretty clear. So I also, so doesn't the theory state as you get older, love can become more companionate? Yeah, it definitely does. And that is, I think, also an assumption a lot of people make too, about older adults as well. There are some stats backing that up though as well, that love can become more companionate. But I do wonder sometimes how much of that is also correlated with ageism, and assuming that there might not be any kind of infatuation or passion between older adults. So, but yes, the theory definitely does state that probably as you get older, it will become more companionate.
Yeah, I just made a comment with my mom. She was passing by, and I thought like, oh, people with 80 something, they still have like 20%, 25% of them still having sex. And she's like, what? So the ageism there is there. But I do know, sorry, I do know like a couple that were married like for 70 something years. She was like 93 and he was 95. And they got divorced because the 95-year-old guy found a girlfriend. So she was very upset about it. And a year later, he broke up with this lady and went back to the wife. And they remarried, and she wanted to have the honeymoon. And they had the honeymoon in their room, in their bedroom. And she put like a note on the door to nobody to like get inside or anything because they want to have like their special time together. So I thought it was like funny and interesting at the same time because I never thought like 90 something years old would still do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really fantastic example. Thank you for sharing that. Both of the different lifestyles that people might be having still, and that there still is more variability than we might have considered in the past. So, really good example that even splitting up, it sounds like they even got divorced, even if it was just for a year or so.
Yeah,
And
they
then
really got
with a girlfriend
divorced.
and then getting remarried. So,
Yep.
yeah, really great example. Thank you for that. So, yeah, definitely there. For sure, just like at any age and any time in life, there will be individuals who are not interested in that passion, the physical wanting to be sexual with someone. That's going to be at any age. Some people will be interested in that or not. So for those people, while this research says this is more for companionship than love, if we look at this, companionate love is still a love. It's still love. It's just including this liking, so that intimacy and that commitment. So that's not a worse or less form of love. It's just different than the consummate love that generally for this theory of the triangle theory of love combines all intimacy, passion, and commitment. So I think it's a kind of shows one the researcher's bias as well. In that study. And so you might have seen that in some different studies over time. We try to do our best to be objective and use good measures, but sometimes we're starting from different places and that might lead to different things. This is why peer review is good too. Giving it to other researchers who might catch things that say, wait, why are you doing it this way versus this way? That can help with that. So with this, for cohabiting, psychological well-being for men seems to increase more than it does for women. So there's a little increase for both, but a little higher for men. So attachment, older adults have fewer attachment relationships than younger adults. So this shouldn't be too surprising when we're talking about social networks shrinking. With increasing age, and attachment anxiety decreases. So maybe just an understanding, or maybe that's associated with something like wisdom, or just realizing that people are going to be leaving or dying, or narrowing your core network is essential for your own health and energy. So in late adulthood, attachment security is associated with greater psychological and physical well-being than attachment anxiety. So if you're securely attached, if you have a couple secure attachments, if you're not worried about those attachments, you're probably going to be more healthy. It's probably also correlated with neuroticism as well, so either high or low neuroticism. So if you don't have secure attachments, so again, attachments can change throughout life. I haven't actually seen too many studies of attachments changing in late adulthood, but that would be interesting. I bet there are some. Most that I've seen are either in childhood, adolescence, or early adulthood, and kind of in that order of the number of studies there are. So attachment insecurity is correlated with having caregiving for that person more difficult. So part of the difficulty in caring for older people might come down to also their attachment security. If they're not securely attached, it might be harder for them to trust the caregivers. Yeah. All right, well, that is not a great place to stop, but we are at the end of class now. So we will finish up with chapter 16, and we'll probably get into chapter 17 the next time we meet on Tuesday. So thanks for being here today, and have a great rest of your week. And happy Earth Day.
Thank you, too.